The cameras once flashed so brightly that the world could hardly look away. Red carpets parted for her arrival. Journalists scrambled to capture her every word, and Hollywood itself crowned her as America's unshakable sweetheart. Sandra Bullock stood on the mountaintop of fame, her name etched in box office history, her performances celebrated with awards that glittered like jewels against the backdrop of her unstoppable career. To millions, she was the embodiment of success. A woman who had defied the odds, carved out her place in a ruthless industry, and carried herself with grace even as the spotlight grew hotter. But what the world could not see behind the flawless gowns and the radiant smile was a parallel story unfolding in silence. In the very years when she held Oscars in her hands and delivered billion-dollar hits, she was also clutching at the fragile pieces of a personal life, cracking under unbearable weight. Triumph and devastation lived side by side in her story. One displayed for the world to celebrate, the other hidden in the quiet agony of her most private spaces. Sandra was adored for playing women who saved others, but in her own life, she was forced to survive betrayals that cut deeper than any script. Nights that left her trembling in fear and losses that even fame could not shield her from. The cruelest irony was that the moments of her greatest professional victories were often shadowed by heartbreak so raw, it would have crushed anyone else. The very night she became the proud owner of an Academy Award, her marriage was collapsing in the glare of a scandal splashed across tabloids. Years later, as audiences celebrated her return with streaming triumphs, she was quietly stepping away, retreating into the shadows of her own home to nurse the man she loved through an illness that would steal him piece by piece. And when she finally thought she had found a haven, a family built with devotion, children who gave her purpose, and a partner who saw her not as a star, but as Sandra, the universe struck again with a tragedy so brutal it shattered the sanctuary she had fought so hard to build. Sandra Bullock's story is not the tale of unbroken success the world imagines. It is the story of a woman who rose higher than most, only to face storms fiercer than anyone could imagine. At 61, she stands not simply as a Hollywood icon, but as proof of how triumph and tragedy can dance together in the same life, leaving behind scars that fame can never erase. And it is in those scars, not the trophies or the red carpets, that her truest legacy lives. Sandra Annette Bullock entered the world on July 26, 1964, in Arlington, Virginia, carrying the weight of two cultures before she even understood the meaning of belonging. Her mother, Helga Meyer, was a German opera singer whose voice filled European concert halls with elegance and precision, while her father, John Bullock, was an American vocal coach and a military man whose discipline shaped every corner of their home. From the very beginning, Sandra's childhood was not marked by carefree afternoons or playful discoveries. Instead, it was steeped in rehearsals, costumes, and the rigid schedules of life behind the stage curtains. While other children ran free in sunlit yards, Sandra's playground was a backstage corridor where whispers had to be hushed and mistakes were never tolerated. By the time she was 5, she was already performing, her small voice blending into choirs that sang Mozart and Bizet. The applause may have echoed, but for Sandra it was not joy, it was duty. Her childhood unfolded in motion as the family lived across Germany and Austria, moving from city to city, stage to stage, leaving her little time to plant roots or hold on to friendships. Each new school meant saying goodbye to familiar faces, and each goodbye carved another hollow place inside her. By the age of 10, she had seen more cities than most American children would in a lifetime, but she had yet to feel what it meant to truly belong anywhere. When the Bullocks returned to the United States in 1976, the silence inside her deepened. She entered classrooms where her German clothes looked odd, where her accent clung stubbornly to her words, and where laughter did not include her, it targeted her. The hallways echoed with ridicule, with taunts that reminded her she was different. What should have been years of joy became years of humiliation, isolation pressing down on her small shoulders. She learned early how it felt to stand at the edge of a room, invisible yet exposed, and it was in that quiet suffering that she developed the empathy that would later define her. She could see the children others overlooked. She felt the pain that no one else noticed. German remained the language of warmth and comfort, spoken with her mother at home, while English became the language of survival, a shield she carried into classrooms and crowded cafeterias. But that duality split her identity in two. She was never fully German, never fully American. Always caught in the middle, her sense of self pulled apart. It was as if her life played out on a split screen. Germany on one side, America on the other. And Sandra suspended in the middle, silenced by sadness, unsure of which world she truly belonged to. Yet from that fractured childhood came the steel that later defined her. Loneliness hardened into empathy. Constant change taught her adaptability. Rejection taught her to value authenticity above all else. Hollywood could craft stardom, but it could never manufacture the raw vulnerability that came from living with scars carved in youth. The girl who once hushed her voice in shame would one day command the world with it. And the child mocked for being an outsider would grow into a woman who made millions feel seen, building bridges from the margins to the center with nothing more than her courage, her craft, and her grace. In 1986, Sandra Bullock stood at a crossroads that would change her life forever. She had been studying drama at East Carolina University, just a few credits away from graduating, when she made a decision that shocked those around her. Safety and certainty could have been hers if she had chosen to stay, to finish her degree, and to step into a more predictable life. But Sandra was not drawn to comfort. She was drawn to the fire of possibility. She packed her bags and left for New York City, chasing a dream that promised everything and guaranteed nothing. New York was merciless. The city did not care that she was the daughter of an opera singer and a voice coach. It did not care about her discipline, her long hours of rehearsal, or her raw determination. In the blinding noise of the city, she was invisible. Days blurred into endless auditions where her name was forgotten before it was even spoken twice. Casting directors looked past her, searching for someone else, someone more connected, someone already chosen. Nights were spent hustling from one job to another. Bartender, waitress, coat checker, anywhere that would pay just enough to cover rent, on a small, drafty apartment that often had no heat in the brutal winters. Dinner was too often a packet of instant noodles and bitter coffee, her body running on little more than exhaustion and sheer stubborn will. Her family could have helped, but she refused to lean on them. Pride and determination pushed her to survive on her own, to prove that she was not going to buy her way into the industry, but carve her place through grit. Each rejection was a wound, but also a lesson. As she later admitted, I learned more from the no's than I ever did from the yesies. Those countless evenings rehearsing lines to herself in the dark, whispering into silence while the city slept, forged the resilience that would one day make her unstoppable. The late 1980s offered her little more than shadows of recognition. Small parts in films like Hangman and Religion Incon came and went without notice. The posters faded before the ink was dry, the reels collected dust, and her name disappeared from credits no one read. Nobody cared. To many, these failures would have been the end. But to Sandra, they were proof that she had something worth fighting for. Each failed project became fuel. Each dismissal sharpened her resolve. While others would have surrendered, she let hunger burn inside her, an ache so fierce it refused to let her quit. Walking the streets of New York with blistered feet and empty pockets, she carried dreams that seemed impossibly out of reach. Yet it was precisely this crucible, not the cold apartments, the humiliations, the forgotten auditions, that shaped the woman who would one day command Hollywood. The fragile waitress in New York was quietly building the fire that would, in just a few years, ignite into a career that no rejection could extinguish. Sandra Bullock was not waiting to be discovered. She was preparing to prove that she could not be ignored. The turning point came not with a thunderclap, but with a spark that flickered into something unstoppable. For years, Sandra had been drifting in the shadows of low-budget films and forgotten projects, carrying her failures like scars. But in 1993, everything shifted. She landed a role in Demolition Man, acting alongside Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes. It was not the leading role, but it placed her squarely in the frame for the first time. Audiences noticed her presence, her freshness, her authenticity. Hollywood, always hunting for the next bright star, suddenly turned its gaze in her direction. A door cracked open. Then, in 1994, lightning struck. The film was Speed. The role of Annie Porter was never meant for her. It had been written for others, bigger names, established stars. Halle Berry, among others, had circled the role. Sandra was not on anyone's list, yet she walked into the audition with nothing but a folding chair and a paper plate she used as a steering wheel. She sat down, gripped that plate, and breathed life into a character the studio thought they already knew. Vulnerable yet fierce, ordinary yet unforgettable. What she brought was not polish, but raw humanity. When paired with Keanu Reeves, the chemistry was electric, palpable in a way no script could have manufactured. The studio could not look away. When Speed detonated at the box office, grossing $350 million worldwide on a modest budget, Sandra Bullock's life changed overnight. The waitress who once trudged home on blistered feet suddenly found herself on magazine covers, the new darling of Hollywood. Critics hailed her as a revelation, audiences adored her, and she carried herself through the whirlwind not as someone who had been handed stardom, but as someone who had clawed her way to it. But she was not a one-hit wonder. In 1995, While You Were Sleeping proved that her appeal stretched far beyond action. With warmth and impeccable comedic timing, she turned what could have been a light romantic comedy into a story that resonated with millions. Audiences embraced her as America's sweetheart, a title she wore with humility but also with quiet determination. She had not just survived, she had thrived. In less than a decade, Sandra Bullock transformed from an overlooked actress scraping by in New York to one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood. Her rise was not just about talent, it was about resilience. She had taken rejection and turned it into resolve, obscurity into stardom, ramen dinners into box office gold. Hollywood, a machine that chewed up countless dreamers, had finally met a woman it could not defeat. Sandra Bullock did not simply arrive in Hollywood. She stormed it, and in doing so, announced that she was here to stay. While the world was still swooning over Sandra Bullock as the lovable girl next door, she was already plotting something far bigger than stardom. Fame, after all, could be fleeting, and Sandra was too smart to let herself be a passenger in her own career. In the late 1990s, while Hollywood continued to label her America's sweetheart, she quietly founded her own production company, Fortis Films. It was a declaration of independence, a bold step that said she would not just star in stories, she would create them. With a studio deal in hand, Sandra began shaping the kinds of films she believed in, projects that carried her fingerprints as both producer and actress. Her instincts paid off. Hope Floats, Miss Congeniality, 2 Weeks' Notice. These films not only filled theaters, but cemented her as a multi-dimensional force in Hollywood. She could command action blockbusters, melt hearts in romantic comedies, and still bring depth to emotional dramas. Behind the scenes, she wielded power with the same quiet strength that had carried her through rejection years earlier. She even stretched her reach to television, producing the hit sitcom George Lopez, which ran for 6 seasons. That show alone proved she was not confined to one lane. Her vision could touch living rooms across America just as easily as it lit up silver screens. Yet Hollywood is unforgiving, and every crown is tested. Sandra learned this the hard way when she returned for Speed 2. Cruise control. Without Keanu Reeves at her side, the sequel faltered. Critics tore it apart, audiences turned away, and Sandra, as the face of the film, bore the brunt of the humiliation. Years later, she would joke about it, laughing that maybe only 5 people liked the movie. But beneath the humor, there was the sting of public failure. The truth was, she had only agreed to take part in the sequel in exchange for the chance to make Hope Floats, a film she believed in with her whole heart. That was Sandra's way, risking ridicule for the chance to tell stories that mattered. Her resilience was rewarded. Just a decade after she had been invisible in casting rooms, Sandra Bullock stood on the stage of the Academy Awards, clutching the Oscar for The Blind Side. Her portrayal of Ligan Tuohy, a woman who opened her home and her heart to a boy in need, was delivered with such compassion and authenticity that the world could not look away. The applause thundered not just for the performance, but for the journey that had carried her there. It should have been a crowning moment, the triumph of a lifetime. And yet, as so often in Sandra's story, victory and heartbreak walked hand in hand. For just 10 days separated that golden night from the collapse of her marriage, when betrayal would strip away the illusion of the perfect life. But before that storm broke, Sandra Bullock had already proven something few actresses ever could, that she was not simply a star for hire. She was a builder, a creator, a producer, and a master of her own destiny. The night Sandra Bullock stood on the Academy Awards stage, clutching her golden statue for The Blind Side, it seemed as if every wound from her past had finally healed. The ovation thundered like a wave. Cameras flashed with admiration, and she wore a smile that looked like triumph itself. To the world, it was the pinnacle. A woman who had clawed her way from ramen dinners in a freezing New York apartment to the most coveted honor in Hollywood. But behind that luminous smile, the cruelest storm was already gathering. Just 10 days after her career's greatest moment, her marriage to Jesse James collapsed in public disgrace. Headlines that had celebrated her compassion on screen turned merciless, splashing revelations of infidelity across every tabloid. The betrayal was not whispered behind closed doors, it was shouted from magazine covers, dissected on talk shows, and replayed until her private agony became a spectacle. For Sandra, the timing was brutal. The Oscar in her hand, which should have been a crown of joy, became instead a reminder of a life unraveling beneath the world's gaze. And yet, even in the glare of humiliation, Sandra chose silence. No tirades, no public revenge, no desperate pleas to the cameras. Instead, she poured herself into the quiet strength of a role far more sacred than any she had ever played on screen: motherhood. Only weeks earlier, in January 2010, she had walked through her front door carrying a 3-month-old baby boy from New Orleans. She named him Louis. He was supposed to be welcomed into a home of 2 parents, one complete family. On Oscar night, she had even tucked his tiny green socks into her clutch like a hidden charm, a secret symbol of the life she was building. But when her marriage shattered, Sandra was left to hold both the divorce papers and her newborn son in her hands. The irony was sharp. The woman who had won her Oscar for embodying a mother who gave a child a home was forced to become a single mother at the very moment her own home fell apart. The paparazzi camped outside her gates like vultures. Betrayal bled across every headline. And yet inside those walls, Sandra was singing lullabies, shielding Louis from even a drop of her despair. She later reflected on those days with a quiet question that revealed the depth of her strength. How do you process grief and not hurt your child in the process? It was not philosophy, it was survival. In the midnight feedings and the whispered prayers, Sandra built a cocoon of love so strong that her son would never taste the bitterness that threatened to consume her. That choice, silence instead of fury, devotion instead of bitterness, became her greatest victory. Hollywood honored her performance, but life honored her resilience. The tabloids saw scandal. Sandra lived rebirth. To the public, she was a woman blindsided. In truth, she was a mother choosing to anchor her world in love, even as betrayal ripped through her private life. That season of heartbreak could have destroyed her, but it did something else. It remade her. It turned devastation into devotion, humiliation into dignity, and despair into a love fierce enough to carry her forward. The betrayal of her marriage had already left Sandra Bullock raw, but nothing could have prepared her for the terror that would invade her home 4 years later. On June 8, 2014, after a long day, she returned to her Los Angeles estate, hoping for the quiet peace that only home can bring. Louis was safely with his nanny for the night. The house was still, wrapped in silence. But at 1 in the morning, that silence cracked. A faint noise out of place drifting from another room. At first, she thought it was the workout area. Then the sound moved, closer, undeniable. Her chest tightened. Someone was inside. Alone, she locked her bedroom door and slipped into her closet, clutching her phone as her hands trembled. With barely a whisper in her voice, she dialed 911. The recording of her call would later reveal the fear threading through every syllable, the knowledge that her sanctuary had been breached. Behind those walls, she no longer owned her safety. The intruder's presence stole the one thing she had fought hardest to give her son, a sense of security. The man was Joshua Corbett, a stranger who had stalked her for days, leaving behind notes filled with obsession and delusion. When police caught him, he was carrying clippings of her face and a handwritten letter. Though he did not have a weapon that night, he owned multiple firearms, a chilling reminder of what could have happened. The real weapon, however, was the terror he left behind. In the aftermath, Sandra's body betrayed her. Panic attacks struck without warning. Tears welled up at something as simple as glancing out of a car window. Nights stretched long as her mind replayed the break-in again and again. The trauma was not just about herself, it was about Louis. What haunted her most was the fear that her son might inherit those invisible tremors, that the safety she had promised him was a fragile illusion. Refusing to surrender to the darkness, she turned to therapy, including EMDR, painstakingly piecing herself back together. Step by step, she reclaimed her peace. Not for the cameras, not for Hollywood, but for the little boy who deserved a childhood untouched by his mother's fear. Sandra had survived humiliation, betrayal, and heartbreak. But this was different. This was survival of the mind. And in her struggle lay a haunting truth, that even the brightest stars cannot keep the shadows from seeping through. Yet what defines them is not the darkness they face, but the courage with which they fight to heal. Sandra Bullock once again chose courage. By 2015, after years of betrayal, heartbreak, and nights where fear seemed to echo louder than peace, Sandra Bullock found herself standing at the threshold of something she thought might never return. Love. It happened quietly, not on a film set or a red carpet, but in the warmth of her own home. Photographer Randall had been hired to capture Louis's 5th birthday party, a day filled with balloons, laughter, and the simple chaos of children at play. What began as a professional assignment bloomed into something deeper. For the first time in years, Sandra felt truly seen. Not as a star, not as an Oscar winner, but simply as herself. Brian was different. A former model turned photographer, he carried with him the wisdom of fatherhood and the gentleness of a man who had weathered storms of his own. He had a daughter, and with that came patience and humor and a quiet strength that matched Sandra's resilience. Where the world saw Hollywood's sweetheart, Brian saw a woman scarred but unbroken, someone worthy not of headlines but of love. Slowly, almost cautiously, their bond deepened into something steady, natural, and profoundly real. That same year, Sandra expanded her heart once more. She adopted a little girl, Layla, a child who had endured more hardship in foster care than any child ever should. With Brian at her side, Sandra welcomed Layla into the family, giving her the stability and unconditional love that had once eluded Sandra herself. In Brian, the children found more than their mother's companion. To Louis and Layla, he became the fun parent, the one who made ordinary days sparkle. School runs filled with laughter, bedtime stories that carried them into dreams, kitchen dance parties that turned Tuesday nights into memories. Though Sandra and Brian never married, their commitment was undeniable. Friends who saw them together spoke of a peace that had softened Sandra, a serenity absent for years. The woman once betrayed so brutally had finally discovered a harbor, a place where trust did not shatter, where love did not betray, and where family felt whole. For Sandra, whose life had been defined by the dualities of fame and loneliness, triumph and tragedy, the ordinariness of family life became her greatest luxury. Late nights at the kitchen table, birthdays lit with candles, lazy mornings with pancakes, these were not the moments the world photographed, but they were the ones that mattered most to her. After decades under the blinding lights of Hollywood, Sandra had found her sanctuary not in the applause of millions, but in the quiet laughter of a family she had fought so hard to build. For the first time, she dared to believe she was safe. She dared to believe love had finally chosen to stay. In 2020, just as Sandra Bullock had finally begun to believe that happiness had settled into her life, fate dealt a blow more devastating than any betrayal or fear she had endured before. Randall, the man who had turned her house into a home and her fractured trust into peace, was diagnosed with ALS, a disease so cruel it strips away strength piece by piece, leaving the spirit alive while the body slowly betrays it. For Sandra, it was as though time itself had declared war on her family. From the beginning, she and Brian made a pact of silence. "We didn't want the kids' joy poisoned by a countdown," she later confided to a close circle. This was not secrecy born of shame, but of love. Louis and Layla deserved birthdays with balloons, not hushed conversations about decline. So Sandra stepped back from premieres, paused her career, and closed the doors to Hollywood. Her new stage was not under glaring lights, but in a kitchen where she cooked Brian's favorite meals, in a quiet bedroom where she whispered comfort through sleepless nights, in a home transformed into a sanctuary of care where laughter still echoed, even as illness crept in. She learned the rhythm of the machines, the intricacies of medications, the patience of spoon-feeding, the strength to hold him through the nights when rest would not come. She kept the house filled with music he loved, made sure the children saw not just sickness but love, an unbroken thread of warmth that wrapped around them all. To Louis and Layla, he remained their anchor, not the disease. They climbed into his lap with drawings, told him jokes that drew out the curve of his smile, and slipped small notes of love into his weakening hands. Those moments, fragile as they were, became gold dust for Sandra. Every whispered "thank you" from Brian, every glance that said what his failing body no longer could, became treasures she held fiercely. She was not playing a role. She was living her hardest part. Not an Oscar-winning performance, but the raw devotion of a caregiver determined that the man she loved would never feel alone. Hollywood barely saw her then, reduced to fleeting glimpses in paparazzi shots or whispers of her absence from red carpets. But behind those closed doors, she was proving that love is not tested in easy seasons, but in the darkest hours when despair threatens to break you. Then, on August 5th, 2023, time delivered its final cruelty. Randall, only 57, slipped away after 3 years of being slowly stripped by ALS. Sandra was at his side, holding his hand. Their children pressed close as silence filled the room with a weight that seemed unbearable. No applause, no cameras, no headlines could soften that moment. The man who had given her a second chance at love, who had made ordinary days extraordinary, was gone. The grief was bottomless. Sandra had lost not just a partner, but her safe haven, the one person who had seen her not as a star, but simply as Sandra. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every whispered promise at his bedside had been an act of defiance against time. Yet, time still won. For Louis and Layla, the loss was equally cruel. A father figure who had filled their days with love was gone too soon, leaving a wound they were too young to name but would carry forever. Their family of 4, once whole, was broken apart by a thief no one could fight. The walls of their home still remembered his laughter, the glow of birthday candles, the soft rhythm of an ordinary life now silenced. For Sandra, who had endured betrayal, humiliation, and public storms, this grief was deeper, rawer, more merciless. Fame offered no protection. Oscars could not comfort her. Headlines could not capture the emptiness. This was not just loss, it was devastation. And yet, even in that unbearable silence, she carried forward. What remained was not despair, but the proof of what it means to love completely, even when the ending is written in heartbreak. Sandra Bullock had once again chosen love, not as a fleeting promise, but as a legacy carved into the hearts of those she held closest. Just 9 days after Brian Randall's passing, when Sandra Bullock's heart was still raw and her home heavy with silence, another storm erupted. This time, not within her walls, but on the world stage. The very film that had brought her an Academy Award, The Blind Side, was suddenly dragged into controversy. Michael Oher, the man whose story had inspired the movie, filed a lawsuit against the Tuohy family, alleging deception and exploitation. Sandra herself had no legal connection to the case, no role in the business dealings behind it. Yet because her face and her performance were forever tied to that story, her name was thrust mercilessly back into headlines. What followed was not empathy for a grieving woman who had just buried her partner of 8 years, but demands. Cruel, thoughtless demands echoing across social media. Strangers who had never known her pain called for her to return her Oscar, as though the artistry of her performance could somehow be tarnished by events far beyond her control. Imagine the brutality. A woman mourning the loss of her great love, blindsided by whispers that questioned not her role as an actress, but her very integrity. The same performance that had once been her crowning moment, the role that had lifted her to the peak of professional recognition, was now being weaponized against her. Public judgment collided with private grief, leaving her battered on two fronts. One deeply personal, one unbearably public. For anyone else, it might have been breaking. It might have driven them to lash out in anger, to issue statements, to fight back with bitterness. But Sandra did not. True to the resilience that had defined her from childhood, she chose silence. No interviews, no defenses, no spectacle. She anchored herself instead in motherhood, retreating into the sanctuary she had built for Louie and Layla. While the world debated her worth, she was making pancakes in the morning, tucking her children into bed at night, and reminding them through every gesture that love was louder than any scandal. This was Sandra Bullock's quiet defiance. She did not give cruelty the fuel it craved. She did not let grief or gossip define her. Instead, she embodied the strength of a woman who had already endured betrayal, stalkers, heartbreak, and now loss, and who still chose dignity over despair. That double blow of 2023, losing Brian Randall to ALS and facing the vicious backlash of strangers, could have silenced her forever. Instead, it revealed her truest strength. Not the strength of a box office queen or a Hollywood icon, but the strength of a human being who continues to walk forward when the weight of the world tries to pin her down. At 61, Sandra Bullock no longer lives in the blinding glare of constant premieres, red carpets, and award ceremonies. Her world today is quieter, more intentional, and centered around the sanctuary she has built for her children. After decades of surviving betrayal, rebuilding after heartbreak, and carrying the unbearable weight of grief, she has chosen to step back from the stage that once defined her. Hollywood has not retired her. She simply walked away to reclaim her life. Her most important role now is not scripted, not framed by cameras, but lived every single day as a mother to Louie and Layla. Her homes spread across Los Angeles, Malibu, and Tybee Island are not just real estate investments, they are safe harbors, each corner a retreat carved from years of sacrifice and triumph. She has said her greatest wealth is not measured in millions, but in mornings spent making pancakes, in school runs filled with laughter, in evenings when she sits quietly with her children, present and unhurried. The same discipline that once kept her body strong for action roles now sustains her through Pilates, cycling, and even weekend dance sessions, while her luminous presence at rare public appearances reminds fans that her beauty is not diminished by time, but deepened by grace. Yet, shadows linger. Friends close to her say photographs of Randall remain in her home, his absence still felt in the pauses of her days. She once called him the love of my life, the best thing ever, words that now echo with heartbreaking finality. For Louis and Layla, he is still part of their family story, a presence they carry forward in memory and conversation. Sandra shoulders the delicate balance of guiding them into the future while privately mourning the love she lost too soon. But Sandra Bullock has never been defined by what was taken from her. She has always been defined by what she carried through it. At 61, she is not only luminous but unbreakable. A portrait of survival etched in both laughter and tears. Her Oscar still shines on a shelf. Her films remain beloved. Her net worth stands as proof of her power in Hollywood. Yet those are not her legacy. Her true legacy is the quiet strength of a woman who has chosen love over bitterness, dignity over spectacle, and resilience over despair. Sandra Bullock today reminds the world that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is steady, quiet, and unyielding. Her life, marked by triumphs and scars, continues to burn with a flame that storms could not extinguish. She is not only a star we watched on screen, she is a survivor who carries her story forward with grace. And in the stillness of her present life, away from the applause, she has shown that dignity can outlast devastation, and that resilience, once forged in fire, never fades. Sandra Bullock's journey is not the polished fairy tale Hollywood likes to project. It is something far more human, far more powerful. From a lonely child shuttled between continents, mocked for her accent and clothes, to a young woman trudging home on blistered feet after double shifts in New York, she built her strength in silence. From forgotten films and closed doors, she rose to command box office records, to stand on the Oscar stage, to redefine what resilience looks like. But her greatest victories have never been the applause, the red carpets, or the trophies. They have always been the moments when the world tried to break her and she chose not to bend. She has loved through betrayal, she has stood through humiliation. She has survived nights of fear when safety itself was stripped away. She has given her heart to motherhood, protecting Louis and Layla with a ferocity no scandal, no paparazzi, no tragedy could shake. And when fate delivered its cruelest blow, taking from her the man she called the love of her life, she still rose, broken but unbowed, carrying forward with the same dignity that has defined her for decades. At 61, Sandra Bullock is no longer the ingenue Hollywood once discovered, nor only the powerhouse producer who shaped her own destiny. She is something greater, a living portrait of resilience. A reminder that true strength is not forged in easy seasons, but in storms that test the very core of who we are. Her legacy will never be only the billion-dollar box office numbers or the awards engraved with her name. Her legacy is the flame she kept alive through heartbreak, the grace with which she endured cruelty, and the love she chose again and again, even when it cost her everything. Sandra Bullock remains a star, yes, but more than that, she remains a survivor. A woman who shows us that dignity can outlast devastation, that silence can speak louder than spectacle, and that love, even when it ends in heartbreak, is still the most unshakable triumph of all. And so, when we look back on Sandra Bullock's life, its triumphs, its scars, its unbroken spirit, we are reminded of why she continues to inspire the world. Not because she has never fallen, but because every time she has risen with grace. At 61, she stands not only as one of Hollywood's brightest stars, but as proof of the quiet, unyielding power of resilience.